Namaskar, good evening. Welcome to Dattopant Thengadi lecture series. This is the 6th lecture in the series that the Akhil Bharatiya Adhivakta Parishad has organized. This is an ongoing lecture series during the COVID-19 period, and this will continue even after that. In this lecture series, the Akhil Bharatiya Adhivakta Parishad invites eminent jurists, lawyers, and legal luminaries to come and speak on topics which are relevant to today's times. Akhil Bharatiya Adhivakta Parishad is a nationalist organization of lawyers, which has members spread across the country. Our YouTube channel, on which you are watching this right now, has been subscribed by more than 7,000 people, and more than 2,000 people are currently live watching this on our different social media channels, including Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. We request you to subscribe to our channel to continue listening to these lectures live, and also any further events that we organize in future. Today's lecture in the series of Dattopant Thengadi lecture series is on constitutional history of Indian Republic and the idea of transformative constitution. This lecture is being delivered online by Mr. Vikramjit Banerjee, who is the senior advocate at the Supreme Court and also the additional Solicitor General of India in the Supreme Court. Mr. Banerjee is a graduate of the National Law School, Bangalore, and has read his LLM at the University of Leicester, where he was a Chevening scholar. He has been a student of constitutional law, civil liberties, and law and religion. Mr. Banerjee, apart from being a legal professional, is also an avid writer and a thinker. His columns have been published in various journals and magazines in India and abroad, including in the Oxford Encyclopedia of Religion. Welcome, Mr. Banerjee. So we start with today's lecture, in which we would want you to discuss the whole idea of transformative constitution and the constitutional journey of India since the British time to the present date. So the stage is all yours. The virtual stage is all yours. Please.
Thank you, Shubhendu. It's such a pleasure to speak at this lecture series of Adhivakta Parishad. It is also a great honor to be given the opportunity to address so many people as part of this seminar. And I think that is extremely that such webinars and such seminars are continued, because in the times that we live in, which are the difficult times where we are all constrained in our homes, I think this is a wonderful opportunity to share our views, as well as to have some food for thought and think something besides the great pandemic which surrounds us. With that, all that being said, and I have a small sort of a talk or a presentation which I want to make. This presentation is on the topic of constitutional history and transformative constitution. It is not that I'll be giving a huge lecture on constitutional history, because Indian constitutional history itself is very, very long, and it would encompass a large volume of literature, which I don't think it can be the scope of any short lecture or a short talk which I intend to put forth before you. So what I intend to do is address the questions which arise. Is what is constitution? What is a constitution? What is the constitutional history of India? And we are all hearing this interesting concept which is being quoted to us very often, that the constitution is a transformative constitution. So where is the scope of thinking that the Indian constitution is a transformative constitution? This is going to be the short scope of what I want to make this small talk presentation before you. Now, before I sort of address the broader topic, it's very important to sort of understand what a constitution is. A constitution, as we know, is sort of the basic ground rules on which a country functions, a state functions. Now, these ground rules, as we know, can be written, can be unwritten, can be partially written, can be partially unwritten. In fact, as all of us know, an actual constitution incorporates both written and unwritten parts. So you have written constitutions, like the United States of America, which has parts of unwritten constitution inside it, one being the very famous Marbury versus Madison, which gave the Supreme Court of the United States of America the power of judicial review. The other is an unwritten constitution, which is like the United Kingdom, where large parts of it is built on precedents, but which also has parts of it which is based on statutory law, which are written. So a constitution is basically a conglomeration of rules and regulations. In India, it's absolutely the same. There are things which are understood, which underlie the constitution. There are so many things which we take for granted when the constitution functions. This is the way, a free and fair election is one of them. The fact that the state respects fundamental rights is one of them. So there are very many issues which we have taken as the basis of this constitution that we have today.
So just one
now, the
small interjection
which arises is, who is the constitution for? And that's the question which will run through our entire lecture. Thomas Jefferson was of the view that when you have a constitution, it should be only for a single generation. Because if all the people get together and form that constitution, then they only speak for themselves. But I think in many ways, over the world and across the world, we've decided that there are some countries which have had numerous constitutions. The French, France being one, Sri Lanka being one, close to our neighbor. Pakistan has had a number of constitutions. And some like us who've had a great debate, we've debated amongst ourselves, and we have fixed for ourselves certain ground rules on which we are going to have our governance in future. That being said, now let us go into, what is the history of constitutions? Where did this entire concept of constitutions come? I would like to and why is a constitution important? I would like to take you back to the first sort of an example of a sort of broad framing of the constitution as a constitution, as a basis, as a model, as the basis of governance. And in Western terms, the first constitution that we know of is that of Rome. The first statute is, in many ways, is like the Code of Justinian, which set out the rights of those who are citizens of Rome and what are their rights, etc., etc. And at the time of Constantine, a broader constitution was laid across for how this entire diverse Roman Empire was to be governed. The countries in Europe, largely Germany, France, sort of brought this idea into their constitutional frameworks, that you should have a statutory law, which basically, as Kelsen, that famous German jurist, finally said, which lays down the Grundnorm, which is the basic norm, basic law on which a state will function. Now, when you have, what is the benefit of such laying down of such a Grundnorm? One of the great benefits is so that people who exercise power, as well as individual citizens in society, are completely aware. They are aware, these are my rights, these are my duties, and they perform according to that. When you have a constitution which is unwritten, then there is a lot of gap, there is a lot of space for interpretation, which, according to some, may lead to misuse. So, to circumscribe the powers of people exercising power, it is thought that the best way forward would be to write it down. Now, as we discussed, the original idea of having a constitutional framework written in in a codified form came from the Roman Empire. Now, it is not that we didn't have things of that sort in India. We had that. Maharaja Ashok's edicts are quite well known. The Chanakya's Arthashastra is also well known to be the basis on which the great Mauryan Empire functioned. So there were parallels in history. And in fact, in India, there were great parallels. But in broader, in the sense of jurisprudence that we know it, it seems like the origins of it, as the way we see it, comes from Roman law. The second model which we speak about was the United Kingdom. Now, for better or for worse, whether we like it or we don't like it, we've inherited our system of governance, our common law from that of the United Kingdom. Now, there are two things which we should all be aware of the United Kingdom. The Romans ruled the United Kingdom for 400 years. They were there, they ruled for 400 years. And the Anglo-Saxon, and today what we call Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence, are the people who sort of replaced the Romans. So there was a there was a great skepticism amongst the Anglo-Saxons, and which you will see, which runs through English law, against written constitutions. Now, and it was believed that power should be exercised locally. It should be exercised by the people. It should be exercised amongst the villages. And it should not have a top-down model like the Romans had. There is a huge amount of history to that. In fact, it's a very interesting thought that when actually, again, if we know English law, is at a certain point of time when the Normans who came from France came to Britain, they tried to impose again the high authority of a single model of power flowing right from the top. But there was large-scale rebellion against that. And in fact, the Norman princes and sort of the second line of Norman lords and princes who were underneath the king rebelled against that. And they brought forward this Anglo-Saxon method whereby power had to be devolved to the smaller courts, to the local courts. As a result, all of us, as we see today, will also realize the entire exercise of two major institutions that we are used to. One is Parliament, which is a representative body, which represents the people from different corners of the country, which was effectively invented in UK as a check on the power of the king. And two, the concept of this common law courts, whereby you worked on precedents and not on statutory law. Now, these were the two great sort of inventions or some of the cultural norms, some of the cultural institutions which the Anglo-Saxons had who replaced the Romans. And so it was carried forward during Norman times, and it became the sort of the basis of what is known as common law today. Now, the great deviation, which we all know what's happened during at the time of the formation of the United States of America. Now, at the time of the United States of America, there was an attempt to break away from Britain. So the Americans wanted to have a common law system, but they also were deeply inspired by ideas of Rome, of Greece, especially largely of Rome. In the American government still has a Senate, and the Senate has its history in Roman law, because that was the biggest decision-making power of the old Roman Republic, of the Roman Empire. So the Americans had this, they wanted the executive structure of the Roman Empire in many ways, the constitutional ideas of the Roman Empire, whereby of checks and balances and the way the Roman Empire had performed and worked through a written constitution, sort of. And yet they wanted the common law. So in that way, the Americans formed a halfway house compromise. in which, interestingly, they incorporated the entire concept of fundamental rights. Now, fundamental rights, first brought in as the First Amendment in America, United States of America, and then later as part of the rights of man in France, were revolutionary, because though they had a very old history, as I said, it existed in Roman law, and even before that, it existed in Greek thought, in Western Greek thought. But the fact that it was brought into the American legislature, very clearly and consciously brought in, was revolutionary for the first time, is because it sort of was perceived that it was a check against complete arbitrary powers of the executive. It was greatly debated, and there is a line which I'm often very fond of quoting. When this entire concept of whether to have a chapter of fundamental rights was discussed in America, Jefferson, who is one of the great founding fathers of America, was very for the incorporation of these fundamental rights. James Madison, who was another great founding father, specifically said that he didn't want rights incorporated in the Constitution, because according to him, he said, who would be so brave as to write down the rights of the people? That is the crux of constitutionalism as we know it today. The crux of constitutionalism as we know it today is the concept of fundamental rights. But there is a line of thought that has always been there, that writing down any right on piece of paper would mean that those rights are now being circumscribed. You write down any sentence means that it can only be that sentence. Your right only get restricted to that sentence. There were people in America, and there are people still, who believe that the rights of the people, and I'll come back to that right at the end of my presentation, are infinite, are all-encompassing, are all throughout. And by putting it down on paper, you are restricting those rights. Now, coming back to this entire question, coming back to India, and this entire question in relation to India, that part of history being said, we have to realize that our constitution was not framed in a vacuum. It was framed in the context, historical context of all these debates which had taken place. Now, when we were young, and we were all young once, we were told that the Indian Constitution was framed when all the great Indian freedom fighters and people who had led our independence movement got together, sat together in our Constituent Assembly and framed and came up with this Constitution. But as any constitutional historian would know, and as we all realized that when we grew up, that our Constitution, which is so dear to us, is a product of very many influences. And the most important influence, and this is something which we all know, which we sort of take for granted, is the influence of British methodology of governance. Now, why do I say the British methodology of government? These are very large terms, because it does not only mean that it comes from the United Kingdom. It means that it comes from different parts where this common law, which originates in the United Kingdom, had spread. For example, now I'll address the question as to how the British framed the 1935 Act at a later point of time. But just as an example, we all know that there are different provisions in the Constitution which was incorporated based on different experience in different parts of the old British Commonwealth. For example, the provincial list system, the 3 lists as we know today, came from Canada. The British government, the Canadians had first incorporated that because they had also had this entire question of the center and the provinces, and they had sort of come out with this sort of a scheme in Canada. Two, our directive principles of state policy was taken from the Irish Free State, which today becomes the Republic of Ireland. The reason why they did that is because, again, of their constitutional history is whereby there were people within the Irish independence movement from Britain who wanted their social and economic views to be reflected in the constitution, and the constitution makers didn't think that it was or it should be reflected, so they kept it separately in a directive principle of state policy. The third is interstate trade, and this is something which I don't know how many of us know, that Article 92 of the Australian Constitution largely reflects Article 301, which allows for interstate trade, and that states cannot restrict trade which goes between different states, and only the Union has the power. Now, these are all ideas which we brought from various different parts of the old Commonwealth, and which were largely based on common law jurisprudence. Now, coming to the entire question of the common law jurisprudence, the entire conception, as we know today, our conception of our parliament and our courts, which are so fundamental into the way which we sort of run our country, is a product of the developments in Britain. Now the next part is coming to Indian history concretely, Indian constitutional history completely. Our constitutional history, as we know today, does not actually start from 1950. It starts much before that. Now, I'll give you an example, and these are things which we all know, but it's good to know because it leads up to the conclusion which I sort of want to make out. Is if you look at the Government of India Acts, the first one being 1858, where the British Parliament legislated the 1858 Government of India Act, which took over the running and government of the country of India from the East India Company. It would be apparent that some of the fundamental ideas come from that, which today we all take for granted. One is, and something which we all sort of know, one is the concept of the bureaucracy of the Indian civil service. Two is the concept which is so much bandied about these days, the entire conception of the government staying away from interference in religious affairs of the people. Now, there is no doubt, and this is something which, again, we should all take into account, that there is no doubt that there is a huge history of this conception of secularism, of people being governed by their own personal laws. There is a history in India to that, and it comes from the Mughal Empire with its own Turkish millet system, whereby millat it used to be called. There is to be a group of people would be ruled by their own personal laws and would be governed by people within those groups who would operate and run these personal laws. The British decided to keep their hands away from it. And in 1858, and this is again very crucial to remember, one of the first provisions of 1858, which happened after the British took over from the East India Company. And as all of us, we know that the history of the first war of independence in 1857 was that there was interference by the British in our religious affairs. So the British in 1858 said very clearly, in Queen Victoria's great declaration, one of the first things which he spoke about, saying that there will be no interference of state in religion, and the state shall maintain equidistant from all religion. Though actually in working, including in 1935, there is no doubt that the Church of England had a specific and a special role in the Constitution of India, but this much was very clear, that the state will not interfere in religious affairs of the people. the second Government of India Act of 1919, which was based on what is called the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, came out with the entire concept of the first House of Representation. It also brought out the conception of communal electorates. For the first time, you had something called reservations. And it also came out with, what we discussed with the Canadian thing of provincial governance. So there is a long history of, when these ideas came forth, and it is not invented in a vacuum. The third is something which we all discuss, and something which, we sort of is becoming more and more clear, is the 1935 Government of India Act. Now, we know that the basic parameters of how this country is governed, the basic parameters, the basic power controlling mechanism within the Constitution goes back to the 1935 Act. And the 1935 Act was done after a series of roundtable conferences. So how can a constitution be interpreted, and this is my question, without addressing or at least understanding the political compromises which went at the time of the formation of the Constitution? When you talk about reservations of scheduled castes in parliamentary seats, how can anyone discuss it without discussing the Pune Pact? And there is a huge discussion as to what should be the method of governance, how should India be governed, and these all go back to the formation of the 1935 Act. Now, there is a tendency amongst a lot of us, especially people who think that the Constitution was actually transformed the people, and we are in a transformative constitution, and I'll address that later, to say that all this is irrelevant. There was no history of the people. Our history starts from the time we've had this wonderful egalitarian constitution. My view on that is very clear, and I'll build on that later, that our constitution, to be truly interpreted, has to take into account the constitutional history of the formation of that constitution. It goes not only across the Commonwealth, because that's what it inspired, parts of it is inspired with, but it also goes deep within Indian constitutional history. There was a huge agitation for local representation. There was a huge agitation for provincial representation, for people of the provinces to be represented. Elections, and the people wanted to elect their own representatives. This did not come at a cost. This did not come free, it came at a cost. There was this entire question of reservation, which is still with us today. Who gets what sort of a reservation? Now, there is a long, long history. There are also histories of compromises, which happens as a result of all these questions. Now, can we disregard this when we interpret our Constitution? Now, the other question, which is the next part of it, is, what were the real differences between 1935 Act and the 1950 Constitution that we adopted for ourselves? Now, I'll mark 3 or 4 things which I think were path-breaking, which changed our Constitution. One was the Fundamental Rights Chapter. The 1935 Act did not have the Fundamental Rights Chapter. The Fundamental Rights Chapter, guided by Baba Saheb Ambedkar, was path-breaking. We had a huge discussion of that. We took a long time to discuss that. It was greatly debated. There were large, back and forth. There were reports submitted. Now, all this was a product of a large amount of application of mind as to what sort of country do we live in. For example, we all know that entire question of what are your fundamental rights? Should you have unlimited fundamental rights like the Americans have it? We consciously decided because of the country that we live in, because of the diversity of the country that we live in, because of the fact that we have very different people of different religions, of different cultures in living in this country. We cannot have, and people with sensitivities, people with sensitivities which were real. So we realized that we can't have this unlimited fundamental rights. So we decided to have limited fundamental rights. We also decided to have this entire chapter on directive principles of state policy. Now, as I said, this question of directive principles of state policy comes from the Irish Free State. We decided to incorporate that. The reason why we decided to incorporate that, because there was large groups of people in the Constitutional Assembly who wanted their views to be reflected in the Constitution. They pushed for it very hard. We wanted these values to be reflected. The Gandhians were very strong. The socialists were very strong. And, so there were compromises made. One of the compromises were all these values would be put into a directive principles of state policy on which every government would be judged. And they were not to be legally implementable, but they were to be taken as a standard for judging a government. Now, then there was this entire debate about emergency powers. Emergency powers was there, but whether to retain emergency powers or not. Now, this is a question which was greatly debated. And it was retained. The question of, there was also ancillary, whether we should still continue with the civil service. Of course, again, it was debated and kept. There was the very contentious question of what should be the national language of India. And if all of us know that there was an intricate discussion of the framing of the article, which talked about how we should incorporate, what sort of language would that be, what are the other languages it could depend on, because it was the subject of great amount of political compromise. Then again, we all know the entire question of the Supreme Court. There was this question of whether we should go back and rely on the Privy Council, or whether we should have a Supreme Court in India in ourselves. So all these were, all these were great differences. As my friend Vikram Raghavan, who's written that, I think one of the books he's written, where he talks about the Jinnah. Muhammad Ali Jinnah was one of the great proponents that there should be an Indian Supreme Court. So, so there has been, there has been a huge amount of political compromise, political action based on which these compromises were incorporated into the Indian Constitution. Now, coming back to the crux of what I was going to say, we have to realize this, and it's very important because of the conflict that we are facing today, that the Constitution, as we see it today, was a product of our culture, because it arose from the people. It encapsulated the people's wishes. It also encapsulated a literally 100-year-old history. A 100-year-old history, and I say this consciously, of our struggle to create a modern nation state from a historical, cultural, civilizational background that we had. We knew that we were one people. We knew that we were Bharatiya, because we incorporated the word Bharat specifically in the Constitution. But we also realized that we wanted to create a modern nation state. And to that end, we went through all these historical experiences that we had. We brought it forward and incorporated that in our Constitution. To that end, and I would like to, say this, and say very seriously, to that end, the Constitution actually symbolizes all our cultural experiences which we've had till that point of time. I don't know how many of you have heard of Edmund Burke, but Burke is very close to me, to one of the great jurists of English common law. Burke, incidentally, was the founding father of conservatism, and as all of us know, as those of us who know this knows that Burke had three great works. One was on the American Revolution, which he said was a good thing. 2, he was against the French Revolution, which he said was a bad thing. And 3, he actually was completely against the East India Company, where he said that the East India Company had destroyed the old culture of India. Now, Edmund Burke says that throughout history, the experiences of the people are produced in the institutions which exist within the people. Our constitution is the constitution. Now, the constitution itself is a number of rules and regulations that we have agreed will govern us. We've agreed at a certain point of time, in a certain place, that it will govern us. That our nation state is going to be based on these principles, which we have decided that we can change at a future point of time, but we need to create a nation. So we need to create a state. We need to create a governance model. So we need these as the basis. Now, so therefore, our constitution, as we know it, is contextual. It is time, place, and people specific. And it also based on the specific, and I say this, political compromises which were made at the time of the formation of the constitution. Now, let's come to the entire question of what is a transformative constitution. The idea of transformative constitution, as those of us who read constitutional law would know, comes from South African constitution, which comes from the South African context. South Africa had apartheid, where the whites, effectively white people, effectively rolled over the blacks of the country. So then they all decided, then they gave up that structure and they decided to have a common government. Now, when they had a common government, it was decided that now this constitution, which we are now going to frame, the South Africans decided, will transform us from whites and blacks into South Africans. It incorporated certain rights and said, these rights will now change us. Now coming back to our debate, there are people who continuously tell us that this constitution has effectively changed us. It has made us different. The Constitution of 1950 has made us different. So the values which they say are permanently inscribed in the Constitution are forever incorporated in the Constitution, are those values which will govern us in future. Now, this goes against what Baba Sahib Ambedkar said. Now, again, as I remind people all the time, that when the great debate as to whether to incorporate the words socialism and secularism in the Constitution took place, and one of the members of the Constituent Assembly, K.T. Shah, suggested this amendment. I think it was suggested 4 times, and 4 times it was rejected by the Constituent Assembly. At the last instance, Baba Sahib Ambedkar gets up and he says that we don't want to incorporate words into a constitution which will burden the future with a value. So to that extent, our constitution in the very beginning was very clear that it didn't want to transform anyone. It was only a power controlling document as to how people were to be governed. It was very clear. It was even what Baba Sahib thought, that values were not the power of the constitution. Constitution did not want to transform people. That was for governments and social workers to do, and Baba Sahib in his own life tried to do that. So constitution's job was different. Now, the danger that we see today is this idea of a transformative constitution, which is a constitution which transforms the people, rather than a constitution which arises from the people, is something which is being bandied about very frequently these days. It is also being bandied about that, clubbed with this entire concept of transformative constitution, this concept of constitutional morality would be whereby the rules of the game of how this constitution would be in the future would be fixed. Constitutional morality is not the morality of the people. Constitutional morality is the morality of some enlightened people. So when you club a transformative constitution and constitutional morality, it means that some group of people will transform the rest of the country by interpreting the constitution to become like them. To me, whenever I hear these words together, it is the most scary thing which I can ever hear. Because in every autocracy, whether it be Mao, or whether it be Stalin, or whether it be Hitler, everybody wanted to change the people. The people, the constitution represents the people. The constitution arises from the people. And it is not the business of anyone to try to change it. Now, the whole question is, of course, we realize that, there are certain parts of people, there are certain parts of the country who think that they are enlightened. And it is important that the unenlightened people be made to see their way. But the fact of the matter is, this is, again, the slippery slope to autocracy. Because every dictator thinks that they know best. Every group of people think that they know better than the vast amount of people before them. So we live in a country which is diverse, which has, the people are very intelligent. And over again, people have shown that. And people have shown that they have risen to occasions, taken on huge powers and defeated them. Defeated them by non-violence, defeated them at the ballot box. So to that end, we should be enlightened who want to lead us and who want to transform the people through this constitutional process, or what they call transformative constitution, which only will be interpreted by them, should keep this thing very seriously in mind. Now, so that in conclusion, so what do I believe in? Where do I stand on all this issue? I would say that if there are two ways to sort of look at and interpret a constitution. One way is, of course, transformative constitutionalism. And two is cultural constitutionalism. Now, Justice Malhotra in Sabrimala, in her dissent, specifically talks about cultural constitutionalism. I believe, and she says, this cultural constitutionalism arises within the history of the people, culture of the people. And I believe that if we have to interpret the constitution, it has to be interpreted in terms of the wishes of the people, which would mean not only what is the public morality, as different from constitutional morality, but also the constitution as interpreted from its cultural, civilizational, and deeply spiritual history. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. That was a very wonderful lecture. I mean, listening to you on constitutional law. Thank you, sir, for the wonderful lecture. Yeah. Thank you for the wonderful lecture, sir. Listening to you on constitutional law is so very overwhelmingly overwhelming experience, and from the history of the Constitution of India to the Roman history of law, it's so very informative and so very overwhelming. It is also important to flag here that the lecture is so well timed that, in fact, only yesterday we had the 47th anniversary of the delivery of the landmark judgment of Keshwanand Bharti, which in a way changed the course of constitutional law in India with crystallization of the basic structure doctrine. In that sense, I think this lecture is so very well timed and so very informative and thought-provoking to again start debating and again start discussing about what exactly is the nature of our constitution. Is it really transformative, or is it a cultural constitution, as I said, quoting Justice Indu Malhotra from the Shabarimala judgment? So we would now be starting with the question answer session, wherein we will be asking few questions which we have received from you all. And Sir would be answering these questions. So should we start with the question answer session now?
Yeah, I think we can start, but I'm having a little bit of difficulty because voice is not loud enough, but I'll take it. There's no problem.
Okay, I'll try to be a bit louder so that it's convenient for you.
And I'll put my ears close to the speakerphone, so people please don't mind.
Yeah. So the first question is from one lady, Neha Sharma. She asks why the words secular and socialist were not added in our constitution during the Constituent Assembly debates and the framing of the constitution. And what was the necessity that the government and the parliament, in fact, added it in the 70s and made it a part of the constitution?
I'll take that question. I think that's, I discussed as to why it wasn't incorporated, and I think the answer was given by Baba Saheb himself as to why that was not incorporated. He didn't want to sort of saddle the constitution with values which it didn't have, which it didn't want. And as to why it was brought in later, I think a lot of it had to do with politics, but there are two things which we should all know, that the understanding that the Constitution would treat all religions equally was understood across the board at the time of the formation of the Constitution. And in fact, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee himself also, at the time of Constitutional Assembly debate, says that. So you don't need to make explicit what is already implicit in the Constitution. What was understood to be secular was that all religions would be treated equally. I don't think that state would stay away from all religions in a similar fashion. I don't think there was any debate on that to that extent. And but even then, the reason why these words were not incorporated, and as I said, they were voted down 4 times. 4 times they were tried to be incorporated into the Constitution, and the Constitutional Assembly voted these words down 4 times. Was because no one wanted to saddle the future with values. And I think Baba Saheb was very, very clear in getting up and putting his views forward on
that. The second question is by Mr. Pradosh Shetty, who is a young law student from Symbiosis Law School, Hyderabad. He asks, do you think that under the garb of transformative constitutionalism, Article 25 is manhandled and misconstrued in every possible way, as we have seen in the last 1 decade or so?
Will you repeat that once more? I'm sorry.
The question is that whether under the garb of transformative constitutionalism, Article 25 of the Constitution is manhandled and misconstrued in every possible way in the past 1 decade or so.
It's very... See, let me put it this way. I think the fact of the question is this, that there is no doubt that Article 25 has been interpreted in a controversial manner, and transformative constitution has been used to sort of interpret that. But my view is that we should not use the question of transformative constitution to address 25. There are layers within 25 itself. And there are deep questions of 25. What is the right of religion? Till what, where can the state step in? To what extent can the state step in? And the entire question is, where do you draw the line? Do religions amongst themselves, are they able to define what they consider essential practice? What happens if these practices are against others' fundamental rights? What happens if these are against others' fundamental rights and other sort of, as well as fundamental rights and public order? What happens on these issues? Now, the question of these issues are, these are not questions which should be interpreted through transformative constitutions. Now, of course, all these questions are before that constitutional bench, which the arguments had started and which has now basically been postponed indefinitely because of the pandemic. But that is how it is. I think the court was then given the opportunity to address these questions, but it hasn't. But it will, I am sure, sometime in future.
The next question is by Mr. Amit Sharma, advocate at the Supreme Court. So what, according to you, are some of the most important lessons our constitutional history has taught us?
One is that I think, all constitutional solutions at some point of time are products of political compromises. And the court should take into account these political compromises, because our constitution is constituted by very diverse groups of people, very, very different. So, all of these provisions in the constitution are products of, we considered various different interests and came to a conclusion. To decide on these without taking into account the compromises which happened, as well as the changing times, because compromises which happened at a specific time does not mean that that compromise was struck in stone, as well as the changing times. This is the balance which has to be struck.